Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive, this time into Philippians 4:13.
All right.
And, if you're listening to this, I'm sure you're pretty familiar with this verse,
Yeah,
especially
yeah.
if you're, leading a Bible study or preaching.
Right.
Um, but we want to take this deep dive and sort of go beyond just the surface level
Yeah.
and see what other pastors are doing to bring fresh perspectives to their congregations.
Okay.
Because, we all need that sometimes,
Right.
like those non-obvious insights to really make a passage come alive.
Yeah. It's fascinating to me just how many pastors are going beyond that simple I can do anything
Right.
interpretation of Philippians 4:13.
Yeah.
They're really unpacking contentment, strength, and faith in some pretty unique ways.
Yeah, so let's jump into that.
Okay.
One of the big themes that kept coming up was this idea of contentment redefined.
Right.
Like, for instance, Connection Church Spearfish.
Okay.
They really dig into the original Greek word for content, and they show how it actually implied self-reliance.
Interesting.
But then they explain how Paul flips that on its head
Right.
by saying, true contentment comes from relying on Christ.
That's a good point.
It's like this really subtle but profound shift.
Yeah, and that shift is so important because it directly challenges the whole philosophy of Stoicism that was
Ah,
so prevalent in Paul's time,
yeah,
which emphasized self-sufficiency.
yeah.
They even referenced this book, The Jewel of Christian Contentment,
Okay,
by this Puritan pastor, Jeremiah Burroughs.
okay.
And he explores that idea even further,
Right.
showing how Christian contentment isn't about gritting your teeth and bearing it, but
Right.
about finding your peace and strength in Christ.
It's like saying, we're not called to be robots. We're called to tap into something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. And speaking of strength,
Yes.
Metro Tab Church tackled this verse in a sermon called Overcoming Lies, Embracing Truth and Faith. And they had this really striking analogy of I can't versus I can.
Okay.
So they describe I can't as this wall built by doubt
Oh,
that
my.
blocks you from God's promises.
Okay.
But then they presented I can through Christ as a demolition crew.
Oh, I like that.
Smash those barriers down.
I love that imagery because we've all hit those I can't moments,
Absolutely.
you know?
Everyone has.
And it reframes it so powerfully.
Yeah.
It's like, wait, I'm not limited by my own abilities.
Right.
I can tap into something much greater.
Exactly. It's a
Mm.
message that speaks directly to anxieties and self-doubt that people face today.
Right.
And pastors have a real opportunity to guide their congregations towards that kind of liberation.
Now, while some sermons were all about embracing that strength,
Yeah.
First Baptist Church at Chesterfield kind of went in a different direction.
Oh, really?
They had this really insightful critique of what they called coffee cup Christianity,
Okay.
where Philippians 4:13 is just like a motivational slogan.
Oh.
Something you slap on a mug.
Whoa.
I see. Their point was that true strength doesn't come from temporary boosts or positive affirmations.
Right.
It comes from a deep and abiding relationship with Christ.
Uh-huh.
It's not about sipping on, feel-good platitudes.
Yeah.
It's about drinking deeply from the source of true strength.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, and it raises the question, how do we as pastors encourage our congregations to move beyond that surface level faith
Yeah.
and really embrace that deeper connection with Christ?
Well, one way is through powerful illustrations.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
something that really stood out in a lot of these sermons.
Yeah.
They used vivid imagery to make these abstract concepts, relatable and memorable.
Yeah, like my New Life Church,
Okay.
they used a clever comparison between the geocentric model of the universe,
Okay.
where Earth is at the center,
Uh-huh.
and the heliocentric model, where the sun is at the center.
I see.
And they said, a self-centered life is like that geocentric model. Everything revolves around you. But a life centered on Christ is like the heliocentric model.
Uh-huh.
Christ is the sun, and we orbit around him.
That's a good one.
So simple, but such a powerful picture.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It perfectly illustrates that core message of Philippians 4:13.
right,
It's not about our strength.
right.
It's about his strength working through us.
Now, some pastors took a more,
Yeah.
well, let's just say unconventional route with their illustrations.
Okay.
Like MV students, they used a rather cheeky analogy involving big butts.
Okay.
They were talking about how fear and excuses hold people back from God's promises.
Right.
And they compared these fears and excuses to a big butt that weighs you down and keeps you stuck,
Oh, wow.
and to experience the fullness of God's promises.
Okay.
They said you got to get off your butt and move forward in faith.
Interesting.
It's definitely a memorable image.
Yeah. It definitely is. And that's part of the point, right? Sometimes
Totally.
you need that surprising approach,
Right?
even a humorous one, to cut through the noise and make people think.
And then we have community church,
Okay.
who went with a poker analogy.
All right.
So they said living with Christ is like playing poker with all the chips
Uh-huh.
because you have the ultimate advantage.
Okay.
God is on your side.
Right.
So you can face any challenge with confidence.
That's a fantastic way to illustrate that concept
Yeah.
of having everything you need in Christ
Right.
to overcome any obstacle.
It's proof that even a familiar verse can be a source of fresh insight
Yeah,
when we're willing to look beyond the obvious.
absolutely.
And there are so many more creative approaches out there.
Yeah, why don't we dive into some more of these interpretations and illustrations after a quick word from our sponsors?
Welcome back. We're just talking about how pastors are using some seriously creative illustrations to bring Philippians 4:13 to life.
Yeah, and there were a few more that I thought were really interesting.
Yeah.
One that stood out to me was North Point Church's swimming analogy. They used it to talk about like the progression of faith.
Okay.
So at first you might need those floaties to stay afloat,
Yeah.
but as you grow in your faith and learn to trust in Christ, you can eventually swim on your own.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
It really highlights that it's an active thing.
Yeah.
It's not just about being passive,
Right.
waiting for God to do everything.
It's about engaging.
Yeah, taking risks, trusting that God's there to support you.
Absolutely.
It really captures that journey, from dependence to empowerment.
Yeah, that's so central to the Christian experience.
Absolutely. And pastors have the privilege of walking alongside their congregations on that journey, offering guidance and encouragement.
For sure.
You mentioned earlier that some sermons offered slightly different nuances
Uh-huh.
in their interpretations of Philippians 4:13.
Right. Yeah.
One that stood out to me was AFM Impact Midrand's sermon on contentment.
Yep.
They really emphasized that the verse isn't just about finding contentment in tough times.
Yeah.
It's about finding contentment in all circumstances,
Yeah,
whether you're in abundance or in need.
that's a good point.
And they made this crucial point that true contentment isn't found in possessions.
Right.
It's found in Christ.
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in the pursuit of more,
Right.
More money, more stuff, more success.
Oh, totally.
But that sermon reminds us that true fulfillment comes from a deeper place,
Absolutely.
from a connection with something bigger than ourselves.
It's a message that resonates so deeply in today's society,
Absolutely.
It's countercultural.
Yes.
It challenges us to really redefine our values
For sure.
and seek that true contentment in Christ.
And Connection Church Spearfish, they went back in time a bit
Okay.
to explore the historical understanding of that word content.
Okay.
They pointed out that in Paul's time, the word was often used to describe someone who was self-reliant, someone who didn't need anything from anyone else.
Interesting. But Paul redefined it
Right.
to suggest that true contentment comes from recognizing our need for Christ.
Yes.
And relying on his strength.
It's like he's saying, look, you can try to do it all on your own,
Right.
but why would you want to when you have access to the unlimited power of Christ?
It's a complete paradigm shift.
Yeah.
From the world's emphasis on self-sufficiency
Right.
to the Christian understanding of radical dependence on Christ.
And they even brought in a quote from Jeremiah Burroughs,
Oh, yeah.
the Puritan pastor we mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
who wrote The Jewel of Christian Contentment.
Right.
And he defines Christian contentment as a sweet, inward, quiet, gracious frame of spirit, freely submitting to and delighting in God's wise and fatherly disposal of things.
Wow, that's a beautiful definition.
He really captures the essence,
Yeah.
of finding true peace and satisfaction in Christ.
Absolutely.
Now, these sermons, they didn't shy away from the difficult realities of life either.
Right.
Like, for example, Saddleback Church's sermon on identity.
They really tackled how our culture just bombards us with messages about who we should be,
Yeah.
what we should achieve.
Yeah, it's so easy to start believing those lies
Right.
and lose sight of our true identity in Christ.
And they reminded us that we are capable of doing great things.
Yes.
Not because of our own strength.
But because of his strength
Right.
working through us.
That's a powerful message.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially for those who are struggling with insecurity or feeling lost in the midst of all that pressure.
It's a reminder that our worth and value are found in Christ,
Yes.
not in the opinions of the world.
Another thought-provoking message came from Faith Church
Okay.
with their sermon, Strength in Trials.
Okay.
And they connected Philippians 4:13 to the ideas of community and purpose,
Mm-hmm.
emphasizing that when we're going through tough times, It's so important to surround ourselves with people who will support and encourage us.
Yeah, you need that support system.
And they didn't just talk about it abstractly.
Right.
They shared inspiring stories of people who had faced incredible adversity
Right.
and found strength in their faith and in their community.
Stories like that can offer so much hope and encouragement.
Absolutely.
To those who are struggling.
It's a powerful reminder that we're not meant to go through life alone.
No, we meet each other.
We need each other.
Yeah.
And we need that strength that comes from knowing we're part of something bigger.
Exactly.
And speaking of stories, LifePoint Church used a rather unexpected source for their illustration.
Oh, really?
The TV show 24.
Interesting.
They were talking about how life is full of cliffhangers,
Yeah.
just like the show,
Right.
and how it can be so tempting to try to control everything.
To know what's coming next.
Yeah.
Right.
But their message was that true contentment comes from trusting in God's plan,
Yeah.
even when we don't understand it.
Absolutely.
It's about letting go of that need to be in control.
And surrendering to his will.
I love how they brought in pop culture to illustrate that. Makes it so relatable.
Yeah, it's a great example of how pastors can bridge the gap between the sacred and the secular,
Yeah.
using familiar references to communicate these timeless truths.
So far, we've seen how these sermons unpack themes of contentment, strength, identity, the importance of community.
Right.
But there's one more aspect we haven't touched on yet,
What's that?
the historical and contextual insights
Okay.
that can really enrich our understanding of Philippians 4:13.
And that's a fascinating area to explore.
Yeah.
Understanding the circumstances in which Paul wrote this letter can add so much depth and meaning to his words.
Let's delve into that after a quick break. We're back and ready to uncover some of those historical gems about Philippians 4:13 because context is everything, right?
Absolutely. Knowing the circumstances in which Paul wrote this letter can completely change how we understand it.
Like, for instance, First Baptist Church of Chesterfield really emphasized that Paul wrote Philippians while he was in prison,
Oh, wow.
which, it makes his declaration of strength through Christ hit differently.
It really does. It's one thing to talk about contentment in all circumstances when life is good.
Yeah. Right.
But when you're facing hardship and uncertainty like Paul was,
Yeah.
it takes on a whole new level of meaning.
It becomes less about positive thinking and more about tapping into a source of strength that transcends your circumstances.
Exactly.
And AFM Impact Midrand took it a step further, reminding everyone of all the hardships that Paul endured during his ministry.
Yeah.
They pointed to the list of beatings, shipwrecks, and persecutions that he describes in 2 Corinthians.
It's true.
I mean, it makes you realize that this wasn't just some theoretical concept for Paul.
Right.
He lived it.
He lived it.
And yet, despite all that, he still declares that he can do all things through Christ.
Powerful.
It speaks volumes about the transformative power of authentic faith.
It does.
And then Zion, anywhere, provided some really fascinating cultural context,
Okay.
bringing up the influence of Stoic philosophy,
Right.
which was huge in Paul's time. And the Stoics, they believed in accepting whatever life throws at you without getting too emotional.
Right. Just kind of a stiff upper lip.
Yeah, exactly.
But Paul's message was radically different.
Totally.
He wasn't advocating for just sucking it up and dealing with it.
Right.
He was pointing to a source of strength beyond ourselves.
Yes.
A strength that allows us to not just endure,
Right.
but to thrive.
That's such a crucial distinction
It is.
because we still see that Stoic mindset today,
Yeah.
that emphasis on self-reliance and grit.
Sure.
But Paul's message offers a different path.
It does.
It's about recognizing our need for Christ
Yeah.
and tapping into his power.
And that's a message that pastors can and should be sharing with their congregations.
Absolutely.
Because it goes against the grain of our culture's obsession with independence and self-sufficiency.
So having explored all these different interpretations and approaches to Philippians 4:13, what stands out to you?
You know what strikes me is that despite their unique approaches, all of these sermons ultimately circle back to that core truth of Christ's sufficiency.
Yeah.
Whether they're talking about contentment or strength or identity or overcoming obstacles,
Right.
it all comes back to that central idea.
We can do all things through Christ.
Yes,
Yeah.
because he is our source.
Yes.
Our source of power, peace, and purpose.
That's so true. And as pastors, we have the privilege of sharing that life-changing message with others.
Yes, we do.
And if you're looking for even more inspiration, we highly encourage you to check out the full sermons that we've discussed on pastors, AI.
Absolutely.
There's so much more to discover there. So as you prepare your next message on Philippians 4:13, we leave you with this. How can you use these diverse interpretations and illustrations to inspire and challenge your community in a new way. Because sometimes all it takes is a fresh perspective to unlock the power of a familiar verse. Until next time, keep seeking those hidden treasures of truth.